Mini episode 1249 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1249. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris here, and we are talking about today the concept of sports in the bubble during the Corona time period. It is part 23 of our Coronavirus Crisis 2020 coverage, and for that we have FDH's NBA analyst Ben Chu with us here today. The NBA is the example that is in the news the most these days, I think, as far as sports in a bubble with what they're doing in Orlando. The NHL always gets a little bit less attention, of course, in the United States, but they're proceeding along similar lines. They just announced this week in Toronto and Edmonton. I believe that was announced on Canada Day, of all things. Of course, MLS is going to have their own bubble going in Orlando, but it's the NBA one that seems to be the biggest focus of people's attention. It's the one that is the most obvious example of what some of the protocols are going to be, so we're going to use that as a jumping point for our discussions. And of course, as I say, part 23 of our series about the coronavirus crisis. And if we're talking jersey numbers, some might call him the number 23 of analysts here in the FDH Lounge, my good friend Ben Chu. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing good, Rick. My residuals are still, in truck somewhere, so we'll see what ends up happening with this one.
Well, that's it, exactly, yes. And, notwithstanding...
The check is coming, right?
I think you're going to have to settle for me putting you over as the LeBron/MJ of the lounge in lieu of that being the number 23.
Yeah. Well, this is unlike any other year, and this is going to be unlike any other bubble time on this too. So. I didn't think we'd be talking much about bubbles in 2020, but hey, well, good time of everything to talk about.
Here we are, and I've already alerted all of our participants on the panel that we did for our 13th anniversary show when we were making predictions in various areas for the 2020s. I've already started to let these guys know, and for the rest of you who filled out surveys for that, you'll be getting new surveys because I can already tell you what our 14th anniversary celebration is going to be in 2021. It's giving a mulligan to everybody for their 2020s predictions and looking at them beyond this. Yes, so there's literally nothing that we were looking at the start of the year that could have been predicted as far as where we are now. And this has been, it's something that still just really kind of baffles me in terms of people who don't quite get it still at this point, and who just think that there have been some disruptions of a period of time and I'm just waiting for things to go back to normal. I mean, we are at the point, I think we're more than 100 days into this thing, but let's call it 100 days or so, right, roughly. I mean, the most transformative ones of our lifetime, whether you want to look at, again, the fact that the economy had never been shut down before, that you'd never had a country go from close to full employment to depression-era employment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The most transformative 100 days of our lifetime, Ben Chu, and we don't know what the lasting results of this thing are going to be, but the world we know now, obviously, is so much different than it was at the beginning of March.
Right. And, I mean, one thing we can also note, too, during the timeline is that, and just to go back a little bit, and whether your question is 100 days, I believe at this point, it's 131 days roughly since Rudy Gobert tested positive for the virus, and that's kind of when it first inkling the shutdown timeline began. The real question I think we're going to see is that the transgression of the virus throughout the United States has seen an influx, and we're going to see
Well, yes, we're going to have that to find out. And as far as we'll take a second here to talk about the bubble itself. But before we do, I just want to get to, again, the pessimism that I had, or I said I thought that it might have been 50-50 on even getting this NBA restart going, where you corrected me on that, I think, deservedly so. What I was looking at the same things that you are as far as the outside world, as far as Orlando. When we first started talking about it, nobody thought it was going to be this bad. It's a hot spot now. All of Florida is. Florida, Texas, and Arizona are all really bad. And ironically, some or all of those had been talked about as bubble locations for baseball, when and if baseball decided to go with a bubble. So this is really, really a bad kind of a thing. And it's a thing where before we talk about the bubble itself, just the general notion of sports in this, I'm struck that I was talking to FDH Lounge dignitary Chris Galloway yesterday, who mentioned that he thinks we're getting to a point now of where essentially we are going to have to live alongside the disease for whatever period of time until such time as either there's a vaccine or really proven treatment options or whatever, and that is made possible by the fact that the death rates have been drastically lowered, although again, we'll see how long that takes to go up if it does, because that's always been a lagging indicator. But the notion of sports existing in a world where we're just going to live with coronavirus until something happens to get it under control, that's the part where I make more of a leap in my own mind to like, man, I don't know. I don't know how you say that sports exists alongside it, because there are so many more inherent risks with sports and with athletes infecting one another, how it fits into a world where we're just going to live with this as long as we have to.
And I think the issue, too, is we're going to, like we've mentioned off air in prior conversations, we don't know the true extent of how the virus will impact people into their future. We don't know the future conditions that people will start to have because of being infected by the coronavirus and other similar things. But I think Chris did hit the nail on the head. At some point, seeing the initial path of the virus, the perception from a lot of people is going to go up, and it's just going to take over time. And in most cases, we've seen that, but we've seen also in portions around the world, not just the United States, that there are areas that will succeed and get higher counts because of transmission via work, via restaurants, via any sort of social gathering. At some point, I think, and we've started to see this in the United States, the apathy of the public is starting to come out, because we are in a situation where we are not seeing the worst case scenario yet. And until that worst case scenario occurs, I don't think it will eventually impact as many people as we believe. And that's kind of partially why in the initial stage of the virus timeline being scary, and the perpetuation of how the media was providing the narrative that the case counts were going ever so high, and a lot of people were dying of the case. The issue, though, is that when you strike fear in that narrative, if people are not being impacted in their normal everyday lives, the transmission is going to get to a point where people will just start to ignore things.
Sure. And to be honest with you, lasting effects, I think that is one of the greatest causes for fear as far as the disease goes, as opposed to dying from it. Again, only a tiny number of those infected out of the millions, I believe, by this point infected.
I believe we're at the base number right now, unless I'm incorrect. I believe it's around it. I believe it's 2.5 to 4%. I think that is the average death rate from the virus at this current stage in early July.
Yeah.
Just on the ballot government. So.
That sounds right. I wouldn't be surprised if it was up to 5%.
It could be a little bit higher. I mean, again, as we know, data can always change. And we've also seen cases in states, too, that were mishandled, or also in other situations where people have died not knowing they had the virus, and then they found out later that they did. So
Sure.
This is one big data experiment in a way, too. So it's going to be tough to determine the true number at the end of the day.
Well, in talking to Chris, he felt like there's been an undercount in both, obviously, registered cases of it, which we know that, as well as deaths. He thinks both have been overcounted, but he thinks that the cases have been undercounted far more than deaths. So he believes we're looking at a less than 1% fatality rate. I don't believe that. I don't think that's a very mainstream thing at the moment. He may be right, but he's sticking his neck out believing that.
I think also, too, in this time where I we've always thought in America during the time of there could be one wave and then a second wave later on.
Right.
It's very possible, Rick, that it's very similar to the ocean. It's cresting and it's going to keep going up, or it's going to keep cresting and then eventually go down and die out. So we don't really truly know, and I think it's unfair for data scientists or anyone else to come out there on a limb and specifically say that we know the direct path of what's going to happen next. Because to be honest, we really don't.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. And again, the lasting effects, that's the number one thing. And if I was an athlete, I'd be far more concerned about what this could do to my health and career long term than dying from it or being very sick for a period of time. But, so be that as it may, so all of this is sort of undergirding why I said to you, and just looking at the way things were going a week or so ago, I think it's only 50-50 that they get started. As I say, you corrected me, and I think correctly so on that, but the odds of the NBA at least getting started are far better than that. They're doing the initial testing now. This is still the period before people are being admitted to the bubble. But as far as the things that you pointed out to me, please focus on them here and lay all of that out as far as the testing protocol and everything they're going to be doing inside the bubble, because it does sound as airtight as you could possibly make it.
Right, and make it honestly, it was even discussed by Anthony Fauci, who's been pretty much the face of this timeline in the United States, that the bubble per se seems to be the best plan. At least from just because there are pages, long pages to get into, but at least from my understanding, there'll be daily testing for everyone there. There's social distancing rules in place. Players will be allowed to intermingle with each other, but they will not be allowed inside each other's rooms. There will be certain areas where players will be allowed to go out and have entertainment. As someone who has spent time at Walt Disney World, the hotels do have pool areas. They have very luxurious areas. Players are going to have entertainment. There's discussions that they might have meetings there. They might have movies. Be able to see the first run Disney movies. There's a lot of things. Overall, there's going to be issues within the bubble, and you're going to see some positive tests over time. But in my opinion, it's still the safest narrative that they can go through, because they are going through daily testing. They're making sure that if there is a positive test, that they run it again to make sure that the test will work properly, and then players will be quarantined 14 days in the room or a subsequent quarantine area. And it just feels like if you're going to try and put forth, like this, one of the analogies a good friend of mine made was that essentially it's the traveling circus at the end of the day. You're going to have to isolate your group of individuals into a specific area, and the NBA is very fortuitous in this entire scenario that they have a already existing relationship with the Disney company through ESPN and ABC, and on top of that, just to even put this together, if you really want to, Rick, if you want me to go into the details,
yes,
essentially,
please.
The relationship, and I'll just go out there because ESPN's Ramona Shelburne did a very great article on this before all these machinations were officially determined, and that for those of people that don't know, Bob Iger was the CEO of Disney, who he's currently sitting on the executive board of the company. He had a very good relationship with the current NBA commissioner, Adam Silver, who at the time in the early 90s was the head of NBA entertainment, essentially being very similar to the NFL films of the NBA. Mm-hmm. Iger at the timeline eventually ended up marrying Willow Bay, who was the co-host of the same TV show NBA Inside Stuff with Ahmad Rashad.
Right.
Another weird issue with that too is that Iger spending a lot of time with Disney's movie production team in LA and been working also with Pixar in Silicon Valley, and at that time he became friendly with current NBA PA representative Chris Paul. So it's interesting to see that there's already both those things in place. And the kind of, I like to say, is to top it all off, the cherry on the sundae. Last year, Iger and Silver were together because the NBA opened an attraction in Walt Disney World called the NBA Experience. And there was already grumbling at the timeline because Silver wanted to add the play-in tournament or an in-season tournament, that Walt Disney World was going to be in consideration. So there was already a timeline where Iger and Silver were talking about a possible scenario of getting something like this together. So that's what I personally think was very fortuitous to the league, to have such a great partnership already off the bat with multiple sides.
Very much so, and one of the unique elements of this with Disney World that the NHL is not going to have with Toronto and with Edmonton is that, again, everything is all under one figurative roof. It's the same campus. It's all there. I don't know any of the details. I don't think they've come out yet about what the NHL is going to do in those cities, but what you're looking at essentially, I'm sure, is housing them in a series of hotels that you are basically going to be able to vouch for as far as the safety of them, get them to the rink. It'll be back and forth with the buses, everything there. I mean, I don't know if we would say it's within walking distance, theoretically, or a tram distance, if you want to call it that, whatever the mode is going to be. Being all on one campus is an advantage that also the MLS will have, because they're going to be doing it at Disney, and I assume they're going to be following most of the same protocols. To my knowledge, there is one weakness in the system here, unless this is not the case anymore and I haven't heard about it, and that being, my understanding has been that most, if not all, of the employees who are going to be making this possible, whether it be on the hospitality end in the hotels, those at the gyms, etc., will be going at home to every night in a community that is now massively infested with this virus. It seems to me, as I start thinking about the, if you want to call it Alice with the Brady Bunch option here, she had her own living quarters, as I recall from that show. I mean, the cost of putting these guys up for a couple of months, and yeah, it would be a sacrifice for them not to be with their families, but they would be safer. I just wonder about if you made the bubble more all-inclusive, if you would, in terms of who all's going to be in it. I wonder if it couldn't be safer still.
And I mean, the discussion right now, and I've read this on multiple ends, that in terms of employees, they will be screened digitally. They will be screened in terms of wearing face masks. They will also be wearing face masks. They will not have direct contact with anything else. But I understand, too, that it's going to be an interesting scenario with that, because on one hand, it's a partnership deal with Disney and the NBA, but I also understand the NBA would probably like their own team together. But to be honest, too, Rick, if you are flying other teams in of like hotel management or anything like that, you're still going to have to deal with the virus at the end of the day, and you're going to have to put these people up as well. So I think that's very similar. And another point I do want to make, I do feel it's a misnomer, because I know the cases of where Walt Disney World is located, I believe it's in an area close, I believe it's called Orange County. It's very similar.
Yes.
Their case count is up, but their case count is still relatively low in comparison to other regions of the area, like Miami-Dade, who had to institute a curfew recently. Parts of St. Petersburg, much more hit. I think and I'll say this, it's never going to be a perfect scenario like that, but I feel like when we look at data of total cases in a region, we tend to believe that total cases is a pure indicator of someone catching the virus. And I don't think that's the case, because I'll use this analogy because I live in Oregon. There are parts of the state where I live in, that parts of the state that I live in, I have more direct access to, and parts of the state I'll never have direct access to. So, in my opinion, it's kind of tough to make, because when we're trained as people within, at least for someone like me who's had media background experience and has worked for major news organizations before, you're sort of trained to look at numbers like that, and you're supposed to be discerning. And I feel at times like most fans are not discerning of that, because the perception is if there's hundreds of thousands of cases in Florida, there's hundreds of thousands of cases in Orlando, and I don't think that's the case usually.
Sure. And
it's a risk higher expense. No one's going to. I'm not going to be out here and say this is a great timeline for Florida. But the argument to say that every single case is going to be at Walt Disney World, I think, is naive.
No, I mean, that's definitely true. And as you said, Orange County has been hit pretty good, but there are certainly other counties in Florida that have been hit worse. And as we indicated, that even if all of the employees who are going to be servicing this thing, making it possible, the behind-the-scenes heroes, if you will, making the bubble possible, a lot of them will actually be living outside the bubble, going home every night. Nevertheless, it being on one campus, it does sound like they're doing as much as they can humanly do. The NHL unable to replicate the experience, as we said, directly, because there are not many places in the world like Walt Disney World where this is possible. I suppose the only other ones would be maybe the other Disney places around the world, and something tells me they probably don't have as many hoops gyms at the ones in Shanghai or Paris or wherever as they do in Orlando. I'm just going to posit that as a thought. But as far as the NHL one, Toronto and Edmonton, in talking to another one of our FDH Lounge dignitaries, my good friend John Adams, we were talking about this, like Toronto, again, you're thinking, well, that's the most populous area of Canada, obviously, and population/spread, in a general sense, we know more populous areas are more risky with such a highly contagious virus. You don't have that in Edmonton. Having said that, for the players that are in Edmonton, they may feel like they drew the short end of the straw, taking the bus to, far-flung arenas, perhaps, staying in a Motel 6. I mean, the choice of lodgings in Edmonton that you do in a world-class city like Toronto. No offense, Edmonton. But it's got its own set of challenges. Again, it's a thing where, and I don't mean this as any disrespect whatsoever to the NHL, because like I said, there's only one Disney, and the fact that Disney is already accommodating the NBA and MSL, and again, I don't think Disney's overflowing with rinks either, so that wasn't really an option for the NHL, but it almost seems like anything else that any other sports league does in trying to replicate a bubble that is not on one campus is going to be sort of the poor man's version of it. Hopefully not too much worse than the actual bubble in Orlando.
Right, and I mean, again, what I mentioned previously, that's why the NBA situation was very intuitive. The one thing that's working in the NHL factor right now, though, is that Canada has seemingly flattened the curve of the virus. There's not a lot of concurrent cases occurring up, not a lot of unknown spread at this timeline. So I think the NHL is doing the right thing by going to Canada. There was discussion they're going to Vegas, but I'm almost 100% sure that once those caseloads started going up significantly, that was kind of publicized by the NHL rep. And I think that if I'm a player, this is the same thing if I'm playing for the MLS, the NBA, or the NHL, or even Major League Baseball, is that on some level you have to assert that no matter where you are not 100% safe on the virus. And sure, you can go into a region where you're more likely to catch the virus, or you may catch the virus from your teammates. But we've also proven the theory is that we don't truly know the pure spread ability of the virus. We talk about super spreaders. We talk about cases where essentially one person gets sick and a bunch of other people get sick. And we also see cases where one person gets sick and no one gets sick. So that's what makes this sort of a tough area. But I think the NHL is doing the right thing by playing in Canada just because they flatten their curve. So the perceptual narrative that there's going to be less of the virus in that region. Very similar to the NBA, even though they're going to be in a more hot zone for the virus, they're going to be in a more campus-like environment, so there's going to be less likely that someone that, they're dealing with the same scenario. They're trying to put together a professional sports league in a region where there's limited cases of the virus that they have to deal with.
Yes, and I think that's an excellent point, that the risk in Canada, while you're not all on one campus, is mitigated by the fact that the country itself is safer than the areas that we're talking about here in the United States as far as where the bubble's going to be. So that's an excellent point. I also think that even if the numbers were still low in Nevada, I still think Vegas would be a bad option, and here's why. Because you and I have talked throughout on this thing here, and again, I understand that I've gotten to be more dour about humanity than many of my friends who share my overall dourness, but perhaps aren't quite at the point that I am, which I think probably describes you. You talk about human nature throughout this and about how that has played a role in the spread after people are bound up all these months, they go out and do stuff. To me, it's people's lack of discipline. It's the fact that people don't seem to care enough about one another. It's the fact that humanity can't deal with the concept of being in a pandemic and behaving accordingly for the months that it takes to get through it. So believing that as I do, I think Vegas is a horrible option. Because Vegas, conversely to that, is one of my favorite places on earth, tied with Athens, Ohio, the alma mater, for my favorite place to visit. I love Vegas. It's been too long since I've been back there. And Ben, people don't fully understand even to this day. They only think gambling. There's a whole range of stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff that is fun and wholesome. I've been to those places. I've been to places that, as they would say on Trailer Park Boys, are very greasy. And I've been all places in between. I've experienced the gamut of Vegas almost pretty much from A to Z. If human nature is, as we've been discussing, that is the worst place for athletes to be. Because I'm not saying you have to have the discipline of a Confucian monk throughout this thing, but you have to have enough discipline not to get yourself infected and those around you and potentially blow up the tournament. And I think we'd be looking at a greater risk of athletes, even hockey players who are more disciplined than a lot of other athletes, a greater chance of them blowing this thing up by going to some of the things that make Vegas Vegas if they had the tournament there.
Right. And I think the issue, too, is not necessarily that on some levels, but I understand that the human beings are human. They're always going to go through their own base desires at the end of the day. But I've always made the argument that with this time, like, I don't even think it's really the nature of risk aversion. Because we talked about this throughout the totality when we've done other podcasts, that the tendency among human beings is to be risk averse. But whenever there's a case or a perception that something you do might kill you, it's going to change a lot of human beings' minds. That's not how I think, but that's just how we think the general population will tend to think. And really, to be honest, I think the issues that we deal with in the United States at times is that there is a general apathy because there wasn't really much of a plan put together during that timeline when we're locked down and we're keeping the virus down. And I find it very hard to blame the general public for wanting to go out, because essentially when you tell a bunch of people you can't go out, it's going to happen over a period of time unless there are systems in place to keep people sustained. I think at this timeline there really weren't great options for a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's where, again, there's always going to be a certain amount of risk in the world because there are always people who have to go out there and do the jobs that keep the globe spinning on a daily basis, and I get that. And I feel awful for all of the businesses that have been impacted by this thing. So it's a matter of, our bandwidth for being able to operate safely and responsibly, I feel like would be much greater if people could be trusted to be safe and responsible. And humanity is showing us countless examples of that to the contrary.
But also, I want to give the separated point in this timeline,
Sure.
too, is that we're looking at it from the United States-centric opinion because we both live in this area.
Yes.
And I think most countries have been able to figure out a way that works for them. I just think the problem, too, is that we also have to, on some level, know that the United States is a vast country. It's not, essentially, it is a vast country. There's a bunch of different mini countries within it. And to try and paint the broad brush across the United States, we're a different culture than a lot of the world. And I think there are a lot of cultures, like we've noticed within Canada, especially with their province, that there's already sort of systems in place that were allowing life to get back to normal, or people to feel like they were safer at the end of the day. And in the United States, we have those systems, and the problem is that they're either very hard to get, number one, and number two, we lived in the timeline of super consumerism, I like to say, in the early 2000s, after the recession of us spending a lot of money. And I think the issue, too, is that we, as a culture in the United States, we tend to focus on individuality more than anything else.
Yep.
And after a while, we tend to wane thin over time. And I wasn't surprised we've discussed this off air. We've mentioned target cities when people were going to start to want to get antsy about doing stuff. And sadly, too, is that if we lived in a society that we had this sort of camaraderie with others within different regions, I think everything would be much better. But again, it's also kind of proven that with the spread of the virus, even in areas like the West Coast, which we seem to be doing pretty well, the virus doesn't really care about your political affiliations or anything. It's just about human beings' individualistic natures, and I tend to think that's more an American thing than it is in other countries. But again, I still think that we're going to start to see a decline over time in terms of total cases. I just think we're seeing spikes right now because people are wanting to be out. They want to be out with family and friends, and I think contact them, there's a tendency within, at least I would say, the general public in America not to.
Sure. And on a to each his own kind of perspective on this, I'm personally a lot less reticent about judging people for what I consider to be irresponsibility in a pandemic. But as you say, the American culture does breed this a lot. So too does federalism, because we have 50 states. Other countries have a hard time understanding the nature of the scattered response.
And I mean, one thing we also have to know too, Rick, is if we're really honestly also being honest, if we're even bringing in Canada into the fold. Remember, Canada is roughly 1/10 the population of America.
Yes.
So it is going to be a little bit easier to get more on board than the site. Now, we could have, and again, I've known this too, is whether you're Republican or Democrat, I'm not really sure if the virus response would have been that much different, because there's so many different small things that would have been different depending on who was in office. It shows sort of the frailties of our governmental systems and how they were able to handle this and how health officials were able to handle this time on it too.
It does. You're right about that. And as a matter of fact, that right there.
On up to too, Rick, just to interrupt with you, I don't think there's any perfect plan at the end of the way. It's just, to be honest, so far we keep just making, at least in the American perception, we keep making bad mistakes at this timeline. But again, to be fair, we open up areas that it's doing right now, and then all of a sudden it could spike there again. So we don't really know. There's no broad answers, I like to say, at the end of the day.
Sure. And in terms of that, in terms of federalism and the scattered response, that's probably a good segue to what I wanted to bring the discussion around to, which is sports that are outside the bubble at this point in time. MLB, college football, NFL, the ones coming to mind most immediately. Team sports outside the bubble anyways. And where I have preached from day one on this show, and again, there are a lot of things where I don't want to be right, but I said early on, any sport that is not considering doing this in some form of a bubble, it is hubris. And to think that, again, we're going to have people going out in their communities and just, even if you're testing them every day when they come to work, it's a matter where you're already getting positives all over the place. MLB is getting positives. I just got word right before we started taping, Freddie Freeman, one of my favorite players, an anchor of one of my championship teams a couple of years ago, just tested positive for the Atlanta Braves, unfortunately. Mike Trout is considering not playing this year because his wife is pregnant. So that obviously distorts the sport of baseball when you have your biggest star sitting out for a season. You just have all these different issues, and particularly it's the sports that are outside the bubble. This is more so where I'm thinking everything that happens there reminds me of where we were in mid-March. The rationalization, well, maybe if we just keep fans out of the games, maybe if we just do this, maybe if we just do that, until we saw that playing games in March at a certain point wasn't feasible anymore. And I think the sports that are outside the bubble, they're going to reach that Rudy Gobert moment sooner rather than later. I just hope that somebody doesn't die before they get to that point.
Right, and at least judging from at least the timeline, Rick, a lot of the at-risk individuals who went to that, even in the early days of coronavirus, tend to be, in some cases, 65 years or older, and people who have chronic conditions that could exacerbate the virus if they receive it or catch it, or however it gets transmitted to them. Most of the athletes, I would think, would be okay. You have to be concerned with athletes who have asthma. You also have to be concerned with older managers or coaches who might not timeline, and I think we're gonna start to see a lot of these hotspot states essentially say that we're not gonna put our colleges will not play in these leagues. That's gonna send the NCAA into a little bit of a conundrum about how they're gonna be able to redo schedules and move stuff around. And to be honest, I don't think college youth athletes are going to be really truly affected by this in any sort of way. But it is asking a lot for a kid not getting paid at this timeline outside of their scholarship and stipends and all these other things to go out and say play a sport with no sort of financial compensation. With these other leagues, people are getting paid, so it's still a work relationship. For college athletics, I have absolutely no idea how you're going to be able to discern that during a global health crisis.
You are 100% right about that, Ben Chu, because again, the optics alone would prevent it from happening, because we're at a fraught time the last couple of years as far as where the college athletes have won in court a couple of cases here regarding to the fact that they are basically free labor outside of their room and board. So the optics of sending them out to play in the midst of a pandemic when they say, it's not safe enough for the rest of our campus to get here, but you all go kill yourselves on Saturdays for free. I don't see that happening. It's probably not a coincidence that I saw a quote today from Lincoln Riley already musing about doing this in the winter/spring, and I think that's going to be the fallback there. It could well be the fallback for the NFL. There's no fallback for baseball because self-defeatingly, as per always, the owners and the players pissed away all the margin of error that they had time-wise to be able to do this. Right now, it's play outside the bubble as configured or nothing. And the fact that Rob Manfred said the other day, sports commissioners famously do not argue against their own interest. Famously, they will put a good face on everything. Roger Goodell will tell you until he's blue in the face that the NFL is going to go on business as usual this year, even though we all know that's a big fat lie. But here's the thing. Rob Manfred admitted the other day, we'll be lucky to get through 60 games. When has a commissioner in the history of sports ever admitted that the season they're preparing for could well be a waste of time? Yet one more unprecedented marker on this road we're on, Ben Chu.
Right, and I think the big issue too with baseball is that they were in a kind of a no-win situation because all these other sports, like we've noted, had either completely halted play or were in season when play was halted. The NFL was already done. Baseball hadn't even started their season yet, and they were kind of really screwed in that narrative because if they essentially lost the entire season, I think the apathy to Major League Baseball is already there in the community of the United States. It's getting outside of World Series, these ratings have been slowly going down. They've been looking for ways to heat up things to play, and they kind of, in a way, they're going to get a season off the ground. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with them. But I think in this timeline too, the one thing I think a lot of people kind of realize, and even I realize too, even though being an uber sports fan, is that you technically really don't need sports in this timeline because you have other interests. You have, we live in arguably the highest level of content creation in any given timeline of the world with the internet, with YouTube, with Netflix, with Disney Plus, with Hulu, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, just so many content areas that you can watch on a daily basis that we've never had before. I shudder to think what we would have done in 1994 during a global pandemic at the end of the day. We've not had to grow dollars in that period of time, but I think we've existed in a world without sports to where if the league does not perform their season, that might do indelible damage that will not kill the league entirely, but could push the league downwards across everything.
Well,
one thing that I would be honest too, and I've discussed this, that a lot of leagues, this is also a trial period for the bubble. For the NBA, the bubble is, even if the bubble does not work, they're going to have to find a way to make the bubble work at some point because the next season is projected to be December and January. I mean, it's going to be the same thing to hockey, same thing too with the MLS, that they might be able to play in their home stadiums, but they don't know for sure at this timeline because we still do not know when a vaccine or a drug cocktail, as you mentioned in the past, will be ready.
That's right. And so until all of this gets ironed out, these are going to be questions. And this is a thing where, again, a couple of weeks back, I knew that particularly some of the segments that we were recording in the early part of June, when it was primarily the protests/riots that were in the news and coronavirus had faded a bit into the background, and I thought to myself, we're still doing these, segments here in this series. People might start to wonder why, but I knew in my head, we're not done with this thing. We're not past this thing, and we're not going to be past this thing anytime soon. From the mid-June spikes onward have shown we are not going to have this behind us for any period of time. So much like how you and I have said on air and off air previously, we're living out an experiment in real time here with what's going on with these, with everything in society. So too are sports with the bubble. Bubble 1.0 may or may not work this summer, but as you point out, Bubble 2.0 might be necessary for the next seasons.
Right, and across multiple sports. And I think this is, and I like something like, especially really just with general with sports right now, we really need to go in with lowered expectations. Because there is a scenario, Rick, that if we don't get these sort of scenarios even together, like there's legitimate, and I don't remember this is the case, but there was discussion at some point that Disney was not really happy with the wide world of sport. They were thinking about maybe rebranding it and doing something different with the space. At this rate, it's essentially housing two professional sports leagues, arguably two of the fastest growing professional sports leagues in the world. And I just think the problems that we have right now, we're not going to have in 2021 at some point. Something is going to occur. There's too much money being thrown at the pile for something not to come out of some gesture that will make the world bigger. And to be honest, one theory that I've talked about earlier was apathy. People are going to learn to live with it and be apathetic at some point, because we all have to learn that we're going to have to live with the virus for better or worse, and we're going to have to start doing things again for better or worse. There was an economist, Daniel Kahneman, once wrote in a book. He said that with people based on relativity bias, is that we always tend to think things will last forever. And especially even with pandemics have a show. And at some point, we're going to have to get back to business as usual. There's a good way that we can do it and improve to where we can go back to some level of normalcy. But I also start to think, Rick, in certain regions, apathy is going to hit at a high, especially if the death toll continue to decrease.
Exactly, and this goes to what you and I had talked about off air, which is that ironically a more lethal disease would have probably killed less people, because people will be scared to death of it. I was a lot more scared of Ebola than I ever was of this thing, because I pretty much had the sense if I got Ebola, I might be dead. And that's the thing. Now, I took Ebola seriously and this seriously. A lot of people have not, at least in this instance, is when it's really been put to the test this time around. This has put us to the test like nothing has in 100 years since the Spanish flu. But this is where we're at right now. All these complex different angles to it. Sports is about 25 different subplots, in and of itself of the whole coronavirus thing here. But I knew I wanted to explore this here with you today, Ben, and again, greatly appreciate your thoughts on this and your perspective about it.
Well, no problem, Rick. At least, there will be sports in 2020. The real question is, will we crown champions? Is the penultimate question at this point.
Well, also in the fantasy sense as well. There's a lot of emails going around my baseball leagues right now about what's going to happen. So,
Rick, no one cares about your baseball league. There's too many bigger things going on in the world, right?
Well, I would like to remember 2020 as a year that I got some fantasy trophies as well. We've already been through a lot this year. That would be a nice thing to weather the storm. But in the meantime, all we can do is keep breaking it down here on the show. Thank you for being a part of this, Ben, and thank you everybody for checking out FDH Lounge Mini episode 1249.